So welcome to the Malcolm X Movement event. It's been years since we've organised a public event. The last event I think we did, public event, was the Welfare Rebellion event in Oxford back in November or December even, 2019. And then the pandemic hit. And then in the summer of 2020, actually, the Malcolm X movement probably did its most effective and really inspiring mass work on some council estates in Lambeth during the black-led resistance uprising of 2020 following the martyrdom of George Floyd. And we're really proud of that. We've set up a front organisation, a residents movement, and we organised 21 separate community programmes for the entire 6 weeks of the summer holidays for children and family and the elderly across some council estates, organised by the residents themselves on a zero budget. And I think actually that's one of the most effective radical left grassroots organising on council estates in the last couple of decades. So that was really inspiring. I don't know if you passed through, but I know you passed through there as well. So it's been a 2-year hiatus. We've been through the pandemic, and today's event is really focusing basically on the trade union struggle. And we've seen a relative shift towards, okay, we're going to go into this and the problematics of this, but we've seen a relative radical shift in the trade union movement. And that's because of the objective conditions that working class people are facing. Really happy to inform you that there's a leading representative of the IWGB union, the Independent Workers Great Britain union here as well, who really helped to show how to organise the most oppressed and precarious working class in this country. And I think that framework of trade union struggle is really interesting. And the Malcolm X movement has been supporting these new unions. And they kind of echo what Frederick Engels said at the end of the 19th century, when Marx and Engels were hoping that the English working class were going to lead the global working class in class struggle towards socialism. And they even said, and being in the London Irish Centre in Camden and its historical importance for the Irish people's struggle, that they said that the English Revolution will free the connection with Ireland. Then, having seen the way that British colonialism, as Marx said, British had the monopoly on trade in the world, and it's no surprising, therefore, he argued, that they've been able to use some of that super profits from the colonial extraction to bribe the upper layer of the working class and the trade union movement. So the Chartists got bought out, and the working class struggle in England got bought out, and that led Marx and Engels to totally have a 180-degree change on their analysis to say, actually no, the English won't free the Irish Revolution, which they saw as being consistently militant and resisting colonialism, that the Irish Revolution will free the English working class, actually. And that dynamic is basically what we have still today. And we've framed this event around the challenges of the trade union movement and grassroots and strikes in the context of Brexit Britain. Now, there might be some disagreements about Brexit in the room, and that's fine. But for our understanding, the interest of the British ruling classes that supported Brexit was a jump to the far right, was a jump to more racism and more attack on the working class. And I think that's had a knock-on effect in a positive way, and it's also brought challenges to us. So obviously, the public sector workers sacrificed many of their lives, actually, through the pandemic. They worked through the pandemic. They allowed the society to have a level of functioning. And now they want something back in the context of the deepening crisis of capitalism, which is called the cost of living crisis. We can't, all of us can't afford our bills. All of us basically can't afford our food shopping. Most of us have got children and grandchildren. This is a very real situation for all of us. And absolutely, public sector workers are actually correct to demand of their union, to demand of their trade union leadership, that they must take stronger action to deliver at least pay at the rate of inflation. It's hardly a radical demand, But the trade union strikes are not even demanding that. But we'll go more into that itself. So we have an array of speakers here and we designed this event to say it's not just the way. If you live in this country, trade union culture comes across as very white. right? But that's not the case. The trade union, the strength, the backbone of the trade union struggle has never been only English and white. Actually, it's been disproportionate, a contribution made by the former colonial peoples of English colonialism. We've mentioned the Irish working class, and they still have a representation disproportionately in the trade union leadership. But there's problematics around that, because it doesn't matter what heritage you are, as we know with our current Prime Minister, you can serve the ruling classes. And just on that issue, I have to say, Rishi Sunak, it's been said, including by the leader of the Labour Party, including the leader of Ealing Council, when we unveiled yesterday at Walpole Park a plaque about slavery and the Windrush immigrants, Rishi Sunak is not an inspirational figure for young South Asian children and Indian children. He's not. He is a carrier of white supremacy and vicious capitalism, which is attacking Indian children and all working class children. So we don't accept that framing of people like the new black and brown faces of the empire. So we have an array of speakers here who are going to bring, I think, a lot of different perspectives that are in harmony with each other. And what the Malcolm X wants to see and wants to contribute the best we can is to, yes, the radicalizing of the working class struggle here. How to understand its history and its strength, and how to deposit that today. So first of all, I'd like to welcome Arnie Hill from, actually no, I'm going to ask Dan, if you don't mind, Arnie, right? I'm going to invite also Malcolm X Movement co-founder and coordinator. Thanks for coming down from Oxford today, Dan. Dan and I have been working together for decades now. We first worked together opposing the NATO attack on Serbia, the rump state of Yugoslavia, back in 1999. We met before, actually, a few years before that. But that's when our political partnership started on Sussex campus, opposing NATO imperialism there. NATO and Serbia, lots of problematics with that. We've had a lot of reflection and critical discussions around Serbian nationalism and all of this kind of stuff, but that's slightly another conversation. Dan has written published a series of books as well, mainly about British imperialism and global South resistance to that. So please welcome Dan, who's going to make the first contribution.
Do I need this?
Yeah, come on. You can use
I've
both.
got to shuffle through books, you see.
Okay, it's up to you.
All right,
Just if you can, as long as you can amplify your voice.
Yeah, I'll try and amplify my voice. Is that all right? Okay. So yeah, thanks for the invite and thanks everyone for coming. I got 10 minutes. Mm-hmm. So what's that, about 10 years per minute. I wanted to look at about 100-year period or so. Mainly, particularly from the 1830s to the 1930s. Really, because that's that kind of period is a period when, as Sukat was talking about, in the middle of that period is when Britain kind of gained this industrial monopoly on sort of on trade in industrial manufactured goods, and that which then was used as the basis of really sowing the seeds of the kind of corruption identified by particularly Engels and Lenin in the British working class. So I want to look at that period, but also to show that corruption was kind of never absolute, and see what we can kind of learn from the change that took place in that period. And I think when I was just planning that, I was just sort of randomly thinking, like, what is the job? I was just thinking about this question, what is the job of the leader of the TUC? Is it to represent the labour movement, working class interests in politics, or is it to represent bourgeois politics in the labour movement and to the working class? And I think really you have to judge that question on the leadership of the TUC by who, at the end of their career, who are they getting the honours and accolades from? And so it's interesting to see, Francis O'Grady being elevated to the House of Lords in the context of with the general strike. I think 3 of the TUC leaders at the time of the general strike, who sold out the general strike just as it was gaining momentum after 10 days in 1926, basically went and just kind of humiliatingly offered their surrender to the Tory government of the time, and were obviously at first quite humiliating because they asked for some little sort of concession crumbs which were just rejected. They said, okay, well, don't worry, we'll surrender anyway. But then, within a decade or so, they were all knighted and so on. And that really is the key role, I think, for the sort of TUC leader within the context of the establishment, is to prevent a general strike, or if God forbid one happens, to prevent it getting anywhere. But I want to go back, to the 1830s, and particularly and sort of comparing this couple of moments in British history in the 1830s and then later in the 1860s. So this immediately before and immediately after Britain gained this kind of industrial monopoly of manufacturing. And you can see, I think, that the difference in how various rebellions were treated, because both those periods, the early 1830s and the 1860s, were periods when you had three parts of Britain. Britain was obviously at that point a global entity. It wasn't just on this isle. You had Ireland, you had Jamaica, and you had England, all rising up at the same time in both those periods. And so 1829, Ireland near insurrection against the anti-Catholic discrimination. 1830, 31, you had uprisings in the countryside, the so-called Captain Swing riots, hundreds of incidents of threats, and then followed through with burnings of landlords' property, and if they didn't meet wage demands and so on. And in the urban areas of Britain as well, the Reform riots, when the House of Lords blocked the Reform Bill that was going to end the aristocratic monopoly on the vote and expand the franchise a little bit, and the House of Lords blocked it, and there were huge riots up and down the country, particularly in Bristol. And then at the same time, Christmas Day, 1831, Sam Sharpe led the Baptist War in Jamaica, massive uprising by enslaved Africans in Jamaica. And all of these sort of conflagrations at almost the same time meant that the British ruling class was forced to make massive concessions on all fronts, really. They ended the anti-Catholic discrimination laws in the main, in Ireland. They pushed through the Reform Bill, ending the aristocratic monopoly on the vote, and they brought forward the bill to end slavery across the British Empire. But at the same time, obviously, there was massive repression as well in all three places. In Bristol, they reckon over 200 people were killed by the yeomanry and so on, and in the Reform riots. I'm not sure the figures, but leaders who identified the Captain Swing uprisings, many were hung and so on. Massive reprisals in Jamaica, and and the reprisals were worse in Ireland and Jamaica. I think that's pretty clear. But violence and concession were pretty constant, universal feature of how the government met with all of those, responded to all three of those uprisings. And then you have the Chartists come about following that to push through that sort of reform movement, say, okay, but what about us? What about the working class? We need the vote as well. And again, the Chartists, really interesting, were very much anti-colonial, and especially Ernest Jones, the later leader of the Chartists. Just find the quote here. When he was leader of the Chartists in 1857, the Chartists were already in decline by that point. But at that time was the beginning of the First War of Indian Independence, which was called in Britain the Sepoy Mutiny, trying to downplay its significance. It lasted 3 years, biggest uprising in any of the European empires in the whole 19th century. And he was, obviously, this was completely demonized in the English press. Ernest Jones wrote about the war, and he tried to explicitly draw links between the struggle of the British workers on these isles and the struggle of the Indians. He wrote that, talking to the ruling class, the universal confiscation of the soil was your great crime, and you were beginning to taste the fruit of retribution. Making explicit comparison between how the Indian peasantry were dispossessed and then the dispossession of the enclosures of the English workers. And he wasn't just saying, as a lot of our sort of supposedly radical bourgeois pundits like Owen Jones do today, he wasn't just saying, oh, this is what's happened, but obviously we don't condone it. He did condone the Indian uprising explicitly. He said, this was the quote I was going to read. Here we go. It says, do you not see that our false system of exchange and credit, the golden crust on which our oligarchy stands, is breaking like the ice floes at the April thaws before the hot breath of that Hindu revolt? I'm not sure why he specifically called it only a Hindu revolt, obviously it wasn't. But he was making the point that, you know, the enemy of and the oppressive system of the English is being dealt hammer blows by the Indians and should be supported. And he later said, suggested that English workers could actually learn from the Indians and should emulate them. He talked about the prospect of the glorious contagion of successful revolution. Yeah, but already, as I said, the Chucks were already in decline at this point, and part of the reason was because the fruits and the loot of empire was beginning to start to filter down to some of the British workers during this period from the 1850s onwards. And it's quite interesting actually, from the 1870s, wages were growing on average wages in Britain were growing 26%, they grew by on average in the 1870s, 21% in the 1880s, 11% in the 1890s, despite the onset of a global depression in 1873. So obviously this was unequally shared, and most of those wage increases accrued to the labour aristocracy, as Marx and Engels called them. But the point is there was an increasing layer of the British working class who were starting to taste the fruits of empire and adjusting their politics accordingly. And you can see this then when you get another uprising, simultaneous uprisings again in Ireland, in England and Jamaica in the 1860s. By the way, interesting, the Cato Street conspiracy. People heard of the Cato Street conspiracy? Yeah, 1820. That was led by English, Irish and Jamaican workers as well, interestingly. But okay, cool. So in the 1860s, you have these three simultaneous rebellions as well. Morant Bay uprising in Jamaica, 1865. You have big riots in Hyde Park, again agitating for working class enfranchisement, the vote. And in Ireland, 1867, you have the birth of the Fenians and their campaign, armed campaign against British colonialism in Ireland. And this time, the response of the ruling class is very different in England compared to Ireland and Jamaica. No concessions this time to the Irish or the Jamaicans, pure repression and bloodshed, whereas in England, very kid gloves really, to be honest, dealing with the rioters. And actually you do get, in 1867, the second Great Reform Bill that enfranchises a significant layer of the British working class for the first time, only the better off layer, who are already seen as respectable now because they've basically bought into imperialism. And so you can, this is the beginning of, in a way that is making obvious at least what Frantz Fanon calls this division that you get under colonialism between the zone of being, where the ruling class respond to conflict and challenges primarily of diplomacy, concessions and so on, and only occasionally with violence, and the zone of non-being in the colonial space, where the main method of dealing with conflict and challenges is through pure violence. That's the zone of non-being. And so you can see in the differing responses, 1830s and 1860s, that already you've got this bifurcation of the global proletariat, the proletariat across the British Empire, into those who will be brought into the house, and those who are just continue to be dealt hammer blows with every challenge. So yeah, I'm.
About a minute left.
All right, yeah.
Comments on the general strike? Maybe?
Yeah, I mean, so I was going to go for it. What can we? So yeah, I mean, I think it's quite interesting. If you look then, so before the First World War, you get you get the new union movement then in the 1880s, 1890s that starts to actually organise the unskilled workers, the workers in Britain who are still not been brought into the house, who are still radical and militant and are not seeing the fruits of colonialism in their wages. And what's really interesting is, I think, I'll try and finish on this, is then how that changes the formation of these, they're called general unions, right? So they're not for specific skilled groups, therefore for kind of all kinds of different works in different fields, and they become very radical. But that's switched around then so after the First World War, it's the sort of previously maybe privileged unions that start to actually feel the pinch as Britain has lost its industrial monopoly now. So the miners, the shipbuilders, the dockers and so on, who start to see their wages really under attack, and they become the force for militancy. And it's actually the general unions who, within the TUC, act as a sort of bulwark against that militancy. And what's happened under the leadership of Ernst Bevin, who becomes the architect really of British imperialism in the Attlee government after the war, but in the 1920s and 30s, in the TUC, as leader, I think, originally of the Dockers Union, he first of all organised the sellout Black Friday in 1919, when the whole world really was ablaze with revolution in Egypt, in Ireland, in India. Obviously, you've had the Bolshevik Revolution. Amazing that when finally, after nearly 100 years, the Chartist demands for universal adult suffrage have finally been met, most of the British workers don't take part in those elections in 1918 because they've lost interest in the parliamentary charade and they're up for revolution. And you get strikes, you get Soviet declared in Glasgow, you get general strike in Liverpool in which police even are involved. And Black Friday is when there was supposed to be a joint strike between the women, the dockers, and
The chair, that'd be. Oh. Sorry, Ben.
So sorry.
It's okay, come, sorry, come on, good to see you. Good to see you.
who was the third group? The trio of unions, the railmen, the dockers, and the miners.
Yeah.
And Ernst Bevin of the Dockers Union pulls out at the last minute, and it's a huge demoralising moment that paves the way for the kind of crackdown and the cuts and the attacks on wages that continue throughout the next 2 decades. I better wrap it. I can't think of a way to wrap it up apart from just saying more. That could go on forever. So
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dan. We can come back on the Q&A with some more additional comments. Listen, what you presented is a really important historical contextualization of what we're talking about. And we need to go into those kind of periods a lot more to understand what we're seeing today. Because, I mean, like I said, there's nothing new in the trade union movement that we haven't seen in the last 100 years in a lot of